Hello everybody, this is Philip Jonas at Kalamazoo Valley Community College presenting OpenStax Principles of Economics. And today we're covering sections 21.3 and 21.4, Changes in Unemployment. In this module, you will learn to explain frictional, structural, and cyclical unemployment, apply supply and demand models to the labor market, assess the relationship between the natural rate of unemployment, potential GDP, productivity, and public policy, and explain the relationship between sticky wages and cyclical unemployment. So in a previous module, we've had a look at the data that we use to collect information on the current state of the labor market. Let's now put that together with some economic theory on the nature of unemployment. Like, where does this even come from? Normally, in economics, when we look at the performance of a market, we often go to a type of model referred to as supply and demand. You've probably seen this before, especially if you've taken a course in Microeconomics. And supply and demand is a great model that can explain the performance of many markets, but we don't see it that much in macroeconomics. And that's because many of the problems we deal with in macroeconomics really come from markets not working as well as you maybe would expect them to when you look at the performance of individual markets, businesses, and consumers. And really, a prime example of this would be the labor market. So if you drew a standard supply and demand model of a labor market, if you're not so familiar with supply and demand, here's what we're looking at. In the standard supply and demand model, we put the amount of the thing we're modeling down here on the x-axis. So in the labor market, that would be the quantity of labor. And that would refer both to how many people firms want to hire, like how many job positions they are to fill. But it could also refer to how many workers are available to take those jobs. And we draw that distinction by referring to those two sides of our market transaction as supply and demand. So the supply side of a market, that's whoever is providing what this market is about. Or if you want to think of it in terms of the payment, whoever is getting paid, that's going to be your supply curve. So in the labor market, of course, this supply curve represents our workers. Now, on the other side of the transaction, we have a demand curve. That's somebody who is hiring or buying something in the market. Whoever is paying, that's represented by the demand curve. So here we are talking about the firms. If you're used to supply and demand, that means you have to pay a little bit of attention when you're talking about the labor market, since in many other markets that we model supply and demand, the firms represent the supply curve since the firms are selling something, but in the labor market, the firms are the buyers. So down here on the x-axis, we've got our amount that's being traded, and then on the y-axis, we put the value or price of the thing in question. So in the labor market, of course, the value of labor is the wage that's being paid to those workers. So again, paid by the company, received by the worker. So in a standard supply and demand model, you now look for the intersection of those supply and demand curves, which we refer to as the equilibrium of that market. And that's where competitive markets, under certain conditions, tend towards. So you could sort of expect, if you thought of a labor market in this fashion, hey, a labor market should result in a wage such that it equalizes the number of people looking for a job, quantity supplied, and the number of jobs available, quantity demanded. But right away, that doesn't quite square with our ordinary perception of the nature of unemployment. Because the standard equilibrium argument would basically say, well, everybody who wants a job has a job. The only sort of unemployment that exists is voluntary, so to speak. People who aren't willing to work for what the current wage is. But we look at our actual unemployment experience, especially, for example, during a recession, and we see there are lots of people who very much would like to work at currently prevailing wages, and somehow they can't. That, of course, quickly brings us to the limits of a standard supply and demand model. For this to work out quite so neatly, there's really a lot of hidden assumptions in the background that don't apply in the labor market. For example, in the standard supply and demand model, we're talking about identical product or service. So we'd be talking about lots of identical workers here being paid identical wages. There's just one wage. Everything is happening in one location, or in other words, location doesn't matter. There's full symmetric information. That's a slightly more advanced term, but basically what it means is employers exactly know everything that employees are doing and how good they are, and the employees are identical anyway, and everybody's putting in an equal amount of effort, and likewise employees are aware of all aspects of what jobs are available. And then finally, for this to work out, our wage rate also needs to very quickly adjust to bring about this equilibrium. These aren't the only assumptions hiding in the background here, but a first example of, well, it's not exactly our labor market experience, which is of course why plain supply and demand is not enough to make sense of unemployment. So what we're going to do here is we will still fall back on the supply and demand model because it's well known, it's easy, but we're going to talk about some of the ways in which the labor market might deviate from a standard supply and demand outcome. And then some other aspects of this, I will mention, hey, here are other aspects that give us unemployment, but you can't really fit them into a supply and demand model. They're too far removed from it. So we will go without a model when it comes to those. So let's get started. How do we think about unemployment and where it comes from? Well, the first thing we want to talk about is then when it comes to the current unemployment rate, as economists, we really sort of mentally divide the amount of unemployment that exists in our economy into two major categories. The first one is referred to as the natural rate of unemployment, or sometimes the non-cyclical rate of unemployment. And basically what we're talking about here is that while yes, during recessions the unemployment rate goes up, even when the economy is doing really well, we don't really expect the unemployment rate to go to zero. Even when things are going well, there are always some people in the transition of looking for a new job, and the hiring hasn't quite happened yet, and there's a number of reasons for that. We'll talk about it. Some of them you can probably already think of. But then quite distinct from that, we have the idea of cyclical unemployment. And that's the idea that our unemployment rate, even at above zero, doesn't just stay at a relatively constant number. Instead, especially during a recession, we really see that unemployment rate just go way up. And that extra unemployment that recessions cause, what is associated with the phenomenon of the business cycle, that's what we refer to as cyclical unemployment. The sort of things we can do on that front are very different from the sorts of things we can do when it comes to the natural rate of unemployment. So we do want to think about these separately. So let's have a first look at this, just with a little bit of data. Here is a Fred graph of our economy in terms of real GDP here in blue. And then we're going to compare that with a calculation, a projection by the Congressional Budget Office referred to as potential real GDP. So that's basically if our economy was fully employing all its resources, here's how much it could produce. So when we talk about our economy undergoing a contraction, okay, contractions are technically about more than GDP falling, but let's just talk about GDP here for a second. We see that during a contraction, here's our Great Recession, 2008, 2009, we move away from what our economy is capable of producing. And this underutilization of resources here, that gives us additional unemployment referred to as cyclical unemployment. So you can see it happens, of course, during the recession, but then it can also really take some time to close back up. So let's look at this phenomenon now in terms of the actual unemployment rate. For the same time period, 21st century, here we have the unemployment rate for the United States represented in blue, and once again a projection from the Congressional Budget Office for the natural rate of unemployment. If you're curious where that's coming from, so basically they take time periods where they consider the US economy to be at full employment, most recently on this chart, for example, end of 2005, and then they project forward for a big number of demographic groups that were considered fully employed at that time period. There's like over 500 of them. Those demographic changes are forecastable. How's the age distribution changing? Things along those lines. And based on that, currently we're expecting that natural rate of unemployment to actually be falling a little bit going forward. So that's the baseline. You shouldn't exactly expect this number to go to zero. And then when we look at the actual unemployment rate, of course, especially during recessions, here it goes way up during our Great Recession. This extra amount, the difference between the red line and the blue line, that's what we would refer to as cyclical unemployment. So the first thing you have to sort of realize about cyclical unemployment, while it's a solid concept, the actual number, it's an estimate. It's not like we know with some sort of philosophical certainty what the natural rate of unemployment in our economy is. Really, you want to think of this as a benchmark situation. When you look at any given rate of unemployment, how can you tell, hey, is this sort of normal or is this sort of extra bad? And you do that by comparing it to the natural rate of unemployment. And of course, you can see that we're talking about an estimate, a benchmark here, because at times the actual rate of unemployment can fall below this projection for natural unemployment. So we'd be talking about negative cyclical unemployment there, which of course, sort of doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you think about our economy already being fully utilizing its resources. Maybe if you think about going on an unsustainable level there, people working a bunch of overtime, people delaying retirement, something like that. Yes, you could think of that. But look, it can even continue for years, right? So really, a better way, in my opinion, of looking at that is if the actual unemployment rate is below the natural rate of unemployment, you basically want to have a little caution sign in the back of your mind that current economic conditions are really, truly, unusually positive, at least when it comes to the labor market, and, perhaps don't consider that a normal situation or keep an eye out for things to get a little bit worse. So with our first look at these two classes of the unemployment rate out of the way, let's dive a little bit more into the natural rate of unemployment. Even within the natural rate of unemployment, we once again subdivide into two major categories. And these are referred to as frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. So what we're talking about here is that there are different reasons why the unemployment rate doesn't go to zero, even when our economy is doing quite well. Let's start on the frictional unemployment side. The labor market isn't quite like a simple supply and demand model. Even when there is a job that needs filling and a worker that is a good fit for that job, the match isn't instantaneous. It's a little bit like when we look at a regular supply and demand model, it's like buying something online. You see the price, you like it, you hit the button, you get the thing very, very fast. That's a low friction environment. Labor market isn't like that. Let's say you want to hire somebody for a position, and not even a terribly complicated position. Let's say, for example, you're hiring somebody for your retail business. So you actually have a number of people on the same job. You've got a very nice idea of the sort of person that you want to hire for this position. Well, can you just, go out there, so to speak, on the sidewalk and be like, hey, I've got a job to fill, and somebody raised their hands like, oh, I'd like a job, right? And you're like, okay, you're hired. No, that'd be a terrible, terrible way to fill a position, because there are big information gaps between you and the person that's applying for the job, which is of course why you know how this looks like in real life. Instead, you will post your job maybe on a website or something like that. You will take applications for an extended time period. You will have the applicants submit their applications in very specific ways. Say, we want a resume that lists certain things, maybe a cover letter or something like that. And then maybe your online application also has a form where they have to fill all of those things in again a second time. Really, you're sort of creating some little hoops there to test people, because out of the applicants, you have to figure out, okay, who do I even want to interview? My time isn't unlimited. So you're looking to eliminate some people before it comes to the interviewing. This entire hiring process is nothing like ordering something online. It takes time. That's what we call friction. And friction also happens from the employee side, or the job seeker side, I think I should say, as well as potentially some public policies. So if you're looking for a job, right, again, you're probably not just, running at the first employee wanted sign you see. You probably think a little bit about, okay, what type of job do I want? What matches my skills? Where can I make the most money? What advances my career? And you're going to look at a couple of different companies, maybe even different locations, to put in multiple applications. And finally, from the public policy side, when people don't have jobs, it is basically universal in advanced economies that we give them some support in the form of unemployment benefits or maybe other sorts of social support. And for more than one reason. I mean, of course, there's the human reason, people on hard times, we want to help out. But also, if we take our workforce and sort of put them under a really stressful situation where they immediately have to take the first job they can find, we might end up wasting valuable skills where somebody who, for example, is a skilled welder ends up just taking a job that doesn't put those skills to use at all, just takes a driving job, for example, because we didn't give them enough time and support to find a good match in our labor market. And that isn't good for anybody. But the necessary flip side of that is the more generous you make these support systems while people are looking for jobs, again, for good reasons, the more time, of course, then people do take to find a new job, because that's the point, right? So all of these factors I've just mentioned that we put under the headline label frictional unemployment, what they have in common is that they are normal features of our labor market, where the job exists and the job seeker that matches the job exists, and they shall find each other and produce employment, but it takes a little bit of time. So while frictional unemployment always exists, for an individual worker, fortunately, it's usually short term. But there's a second type of natural unemployment that's much tougher on workers, what we refer to as structural unemployment. So there's a number of reasons where even if the economy is not in a contraction, you can get a longer term mismatch between the number of job seekers and the available work. When you first hear that definition, it almost sounds a little weird. Mismatch between the number of job seekers and the available work. Isn't that what unemployment is in general? Well, what we're talking about here is that this is expected to be long-term or permanent and is not being caused by the business cycle. There are a number of environmental features that can give us structural unemployment, but just a few of them we'll talk about are the ideas of skills being mismatched, location being mismatched, productivity changes that are unexpected and thereby throw certain numbers out of whack, as well as perhaps the idea that government regulations can have an impact here as well. So skills and location, we'll just look at some numbers there. And then for productivity, we can actually show that a little bit using a supply and demand style approach. Let's start out with skills. So, of course, the way in which our economy gets work done changes over time, right? Like, obviously, there are jobs that exist today that didn't used to. There are jobs that used to exist that are either gone or just far fewer people doing them. So everybody who trained for those jobs will not be able to find one of those jobs. Some will, but not all. Example that I'm fond of is the idea of being a computer. That used to be an occupation because many aspects of our economy require lots of math to be done, like insurance, banking, space travel, right? But before electronic computers became widely available and cheap, or even available at all, how do you do the math? Lots and lots of people did the math, and these people were called computers. And once computers, in our modern sense, became available, very few of them were still employed. I mean, some of them could transition into, programming jobs. Obviously, that was the natural transition. Many great stories, actually, to be told there about like the first professional programmers, the ENIAC computer, things like that. But the real bottom line is that far fewer people would be needed. That's the point. That's the fundamental nature of technological progress. And we could, now get mad at the progress and say, oh no, the jobs are gone. But ultimately, this is what makes us richer, being able to do more work with the available labor. So where you see this sort of structural unemployment, or at least a first strong hint at this, and we've looked at this particular graph before, is when you look at how unemployment rates vary by education level. So starting from the top here, we've got the unemployment rate for people without a high school diploma, in green with a high school diploma, yellow associate's degree, orange bachelor's degree. And then starting in 2015, we've got master's degree or higher here from the Bureau of Labor Statistics as well. And what you can see is that permanently, so this is what we would call structurally, people with a lower education level have a higher rate of unemployment. And I want to highlight that because when we talk about the natural rate of unemployment, we're not trying to say, let's not worry about it, this is natural. We even want the natural rate of unemployment to be lower. But this is very different than combating a business cycle. When you talk about frictional unemployment to be lower, okay, we want to speed up the job matching process. There's only so much that can be done there because of the information problems. But for example, the idea that jobs are posted on the internet and have online applications has certainly made this much faster than, let's say, 30 years ago, when maybe you'd wait for the Sunday paper where all the job postings were, and then you applied by mail. And if you wanted to apply for a job out of town, you had to get your hand on the paper from there. Okay, so that's some progress there. Structural unemployment, when we're talking about a skills mismatch, well, again, solutions exist, but they are hard, they take time, because what we're talking about fundamentally here, retraining, education. I mean, number one, you get people up that educational ladder, their average unemployment rate is lower, perhaps they become more flexible at switching jobs. And also, of course, if the new jobs occur, if we can put together some go-to-work training programs there, we can bring the structural unemployment rate lower. Super, great, definitely what we're looking for. This is an example of skills-based structural unemployment. Let's look at location next. So here we've got some nice lines of unemployment rates by education, but these are, of course, at the national level. And for most people, the labor market isn't a national experience. It's much more local because, especially as people get older, it becomes harder and less desirable to move for many of them. So let's look at the unemployment rate again, but this time at a county level throughout the United States. And basically what I'm doing here in terms of the coding is, currently we think the natural unemployment rate is around 4.5% or so. So anything here in green under that definition could be said to not be experiencing cyclical unemployment. But even while cyclical unemployment in the United States currently is zero or arguably negative, we do still see areas here in red that have unemployment higher than that natural rate of unemployment. So then that's what we would refer to as structural. Here's Hawaii with a very low unemployment rate. Here's a region of Alaska with a very high unemployment rate. Wouldn't it be nice if we can take that worker from here, put that worker over here, and now they have a job, right? But of course, you could already tell it's kind of ridiculous. Changing location is hard. And again, if we want to bring this type of unemployment down, structural unemployment, we have much tougher policies to consider. How do you increase worker mobility? How do you make it easier to move, make sure people don't get locked into their homes or into certain networks? And of course, much of that's also just human nature, and people have friends and family and they don't want to move. And of course, ultimately, that has to be acceptable as well. So if we've got areas with higher structural unemployment, what can we do to get some economic development into those regions? So these are two types of structural unemployment we're looking at just in terms of the data. Now let's look at one where we can actually use that supply and demand model a little bit. So again, regular, ordinary, vanilla supply and demand, maybe not the greatest way of thinking about the labor market. But we can use supply and demand to think about the labor market in terms of how does the labor market behave a little different from an ordinary supply and demand model. And one of these ways is that the labor market is full of information problems. It is actually kind of hard to tell what the value of many types of workers is and how productive they are. Because, in a modern disaggregated company, here you've got somebody, over in accounting and they're doing good work. You need that accountant. But how much is that accountant and the quality of that accountant changing how many widgets, so to speak, you're producing? So what happens is you are feeling out what your company is doing, right? You're observing as a whole how much more productive the company becomes. You observe how that works over the years. You observe how hard it is to hire different classes of employees, and then you raise wages to try to keep yourself in alignment with what you think you need to fill your organization with good people. So let's, for example, say productivity, after you've observed it for a while, behaves in an unexpected fashion now. So we're going to start out with productivity rising over a couple of years. So because productivity is higher, that means there's now a greater demand for these types of workers. They effectively become worth more. So wages start going up. More of them have jobs. And then it happens again. And these wages, they're sort of running up at a predictable rate. And across our industry, these types of employees, there's now an annual wage progression that has started to become the standard. But then unexpectedly, and often you can't even tell at first, the productivity increases go away, but the wages are still going up because it's so difficult to notice. So wage keeps going up, even when we're past that equilibrium. And we end up with a situation where wages are higher than an equilibrium outcome. So the number of people who want to work those jobs now exceeds the number of positions that are being hired for. So this is one of the ways in which you can use still a supply and demand diagram but you're really talking about a story that's a little bit different from a market that self-adjusts to an equilibrium. This can happen the other way around as well. If we have a job that's sort of considered to be very standard and unchanging, and wages in this industry are set, and now productivity unexpectedly increases while everybody's wages are still set, once again we find ourselves in a disequilibrium situation. There are now more and more businesses looking for these workers. Quantity demanded increases. But at current wages, there's a limit to how many workers want to be in that area of our labor market. And this is, of course, the opposite of unemployment here. Now it's really hard to find these workers. Companies might even complain about a worker shortage when really what we have to wait for is for those wages to go up. So again, a nice example of a story where, we don't have perfect, smooth price adjustment. With structural and frictional unemployment out of the way, that being our natural rate of unemployment, let's now turn to the other side of the ledger, the business cycle. Our economy goes through expansions and contractions, and those can have impacts on the unemployment rate, and these impacts can be long-lasting. In fact, many years long-lasting, much longer than standard supply and demand would suggest. This is referred to as cyclical unemployment. Here is our unemployment rate going above natural during a contraction in gray. But then even after the contraction ends, it can just take years and years for the unemployment rate to naturalize again. Except, of course, for what will forever ruin my charts, the COVID shutdown, because as we took the shutdown away, unemployment very quickly came back down. But perhaps a nice counterexample there in the data. So what's going on there? I mean, supply and demand would normally say that markets should self-adjust way faster than that. Well, while there are multiple ways we look at cyclical unemployment, the one we are going to focus on are the phenomenon of so-called sticky wages. So stickiness in economics refers to a variable that's slow to adjust. It turns out wages, unlike many other prices in our economy, are quite sticky, quite slow to adjust. Let me just mention a practical example here. Think about the price at a gas station. How often can that adjust, right? And the answer is like all the time, every day, maybe multiple times a day, right? But then think about most jobs. How often do the wages of the workers at those jobs adjust? Every day, a couple times a day? That is super rare. Most jobs adjust wages, maybe once or twice a year. And even when those adjustment points happen, you don't often see radical changes unless, there's a long-running imbalance that's trying to be corrected. Now, we have multiple hypotheses in economics why wages are so sticky. These are hotly debated and researched, but let me just mention some of the leading ones to you. And I've also got these a little bit in the personal ranking I would give to how important they are. So my personal favorite, the efficiency wage argument. Here the argument is that when you're buying a worker, you're not buying an identical widget or a robot. You're making a deal with people, and how much people are paid affects how productive they are. So the idea here is, the reason it's called efficiency wages isn't because of some inefficiency, so to speak, but because it's actually more than worth it from a profit standpoint for the firms to pay more. There are different subversions of the efficiency wage hypotheses, but two common ones relate to worker effort and worker turnover. Worker effort being the idea that if you pay an employee relatively more, they now are more concerned with making sure they get to keep that job. So assuming for a second that you cannot perfectly monitor how much effort employees are putting in, perhaps if an employee is doing bad things, there's only a probability you will catch them. Nevertheless, workers who are paid more, even if there's only a probability they'll be caught, are now less likely to misbehave because the job is more worth it. Another absolute classic we see in the efficiency wage area is the idea of worker turnover. That if new workers need some time to get literally up to speed, so to speak, at the job, and that the performance of workers is dependent on one another, then every time you hire new people, you're sort of across the board dragging down the productivity of your employees. So it may be worth it to pay a relatively higher wage than is necessary to fill the jobs if it means workers stick around longer and you thereby secure greater average productivity. So those are efficiency wages. What else do we have? Adverse selection. Here the idea is, even if wage cuts are what supply and demand would suggest should happen, right? You can sort of fill the positions you have, even at a lower wage. Let's say there's a recession, so the employees need you more. You nevertheless are super reluctant to cut wages, because every time you cut wages, employees leave. Now, that by itself might not be the end of the world. Maybe you're in a recession, maybe there actually have to be some layoffs, but wage cuts are a dangerous way to do that. Because when employees leave due to wage cuts, who leaves isn't random. It isn't a random selection. It's an adverse selection. What adverse selection means in this context is that systematically your better employees are more likely to leave because they have better opportunities elsewhere. So you're worried about doing wage cuts because it might deteriorate the quality of your workforce. Perhaps it's, better to just do random layoffs if you can't even tell who your best employees are, or to, specifically try to eliminate low performers than to lower wages. Next, we have the relative wage coordination argument. Okay, that's a pretty big term. Here the idea is that during a recession, workers lose their jobs, and perhaps if they agree to wage cuts, everybody gets to keep their job. And perhaps as a group, workers would actually prefer, hey, let's all take a 10% wage cut if it means we all get to keep our jobs, because it's better than the risk of losing your job. But here you have what's called a collective action problem. So with a collective action problem, what we're talking about is that even if workers want to take those wage cuts as a group, no individual worker wants to take the wage cut. Because how do you enforce that everybody else does as well? So if you take the wage cut just by yourself, you haven't at all reduced the probability that there's layoffs, and now you make less money, and you make less money than other people doing the same work. Everything is a downside for you. So you can't coordinate the labor force across the economy to take a wage cut in the face of a recession. At this point, I'm also already starting to be a slightly smaller fan of these sticky wage hypotheses, at least when we're talking about an entire macroeconomic level. But finally, let's get to the insider-outsider model. So this is the idea that workers that have been working in a company for a while have a different degree of market power over the company than workers who are outside of the company. So when we have a situation where there's unemployment, the unemployment is the problem of people who aren't working at the companies, and the people who are working at the companies, perhaps with longer tenure, they have some power over that company. Basically, every company always relies on a critical mass of insiders that are familiar with the softer aspects of the work, the procedures, the rules, the company culture, to keep it running. And these insiders will fight very hard against wages falling because the cost of there being too few employees isn't borne by them. So whichever version of the sticky wage hypotheses are most appealing to you, really what matters to us here is that all of them produce very similar effects. So if we think of this as a deviation from standard supply and demand, if we have a wage that can't fall to the equilibrium, if we are at an above equilibrium wage, once again, the number of people who want to work here exceeds the number of people that the company wants to hire, and we end up with involuntary unemployment. What's extra fascinating about this sticky wage hypothesis is how well, in some ways, I think it mirrors the data. Because look at what the prediction here is. We basically have two axes, right? We have prediction down here that with these sticky wages, the number of people looking for work exceeds the demand for the workers. And we have the prediction that wages just don't fall. So let's look at the data. Here, I'm representing the demand for workers in blue as the combination of both jobs that are filled, employment, and job openings. And then in red, the number of people who are ready and willing to work, the civilian labor force. So again, that's people with jobs and people who don't have jobs. So first prediction of our sticky wage hypothesis here is that this market doesn't clear very well. It doesn't bring quantity supplied and demanded into balance very nicely. We can end up with the gaps, and we of course see the gaps here. Recession, available jobs fall, people still want work, gap, 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 gap. Even bigger recession, jobs fall, people still want work, gap. And then of course, very interesting here more recently, the gaps reversed a little bit. Lots of baby boomers retiring and such. Now, more jobs looking to hire than the number of people willing to fill them, right? Right now, very unusually low unemployment rate. And then second hypothesis, and this is where it really comes together. Look at what's going on with wages. So standard supply and demand would say, if we have many more people looking for a job than the number of jobs that the employers want to fill, that should put downward pressure on the wages. Those wages should come down, right? But for the same time period now, keep track of the recessions. Let's look at average wages for private sector employees. And we're doing this on an hourly basis so that the change in how many hours are being worked doesn't affect anything. And you can tell it's just an upward trending line here with inflation and a little bit extra. They're not falling during the recession. Even the really bad Great Recession, nope, wages keep on going up. And of course, our little artifact here that'll ruin my charts forever. Here, average hourly compensation going up when we did some stimulus payments because we're taking how much income people have, we're dividing it by the hours worked, so there's actually a temporary bump there. But we see wages just keep increasing, and even though now that there are more job openings than people available to fill them, yes, wage increases are a little bit faster, but maybe not even as fast as you would expect. So this whole sticky wage story also seems to be somewhat asymmetric. When there is excess unemployment and lots of extra people looking for work, wages just very rarely fall. And then when there's extra available jobs that, there aren't enough workers to fill, wages do rise faster, but perhaps not by a huge amount. So let's look at this from the perspective of supply and demand. First, let's say there's expanding demand for labor. So this is our more recent story here with lots and lots of available jobs. Sticky wages might be a little bit weaker in the up direction because the downsides to adjusting wages don't really apply as much when you're raising wages. You're raising wages, you're not worrying about your best employees leaving. That doesn't happen, right? You're raising wages, that's not going to be bad for turnover or effort or anything like that. So on the demand increases side, we see wages increasing. Here I'm doing full market clearing, so we're going straight to the new equilibrium. Perhaps wages don't all the way increase that fast. Perhaps they're somewhat sticky in the up direction as well, in which case we get quantity demanded exceeding quantity supplied by a bit, like we saw in our data. But then let's look at what happens with contracting demand for labor. So here, for example, let's talk about the Great Recession 2008-2009. Let's say the demand for labor falls, and where ordinary supply and demand might say, okay, wages are going to fall to bring that market back in balance. Let's say they are completely sticky, like we saw in the data. Wages just don't fall at all. And now what happens? Quantity supplied is unchanged. Lots of workers still looking for a job. Fewer of those companies actually looking to fill those jobs. Big mismatch. Lots more people looking for jobs than jobs available. We have unemployment and no declining wages. And, if the specific cause for the recession is in some sectors of our economy, that doesn't necessarily mean that this unemployment is going to be limited to those sectors of the economy, because we have all this extra unemployment here. Some of those people will be willing and capable to move in other areas. So we could think of our economy as these connected labor markets, and now somewhere else in our economy, as a consequence of this contraction, these extra workers show up. Now they want jobs over here. Supply of labor increases. If wages are sticky, if they stay at the higher level, rather than those extra workers driving wages down, what's more likely to happen is that we see there being an increase in the workers in excess of available jobs, and the unemployment spills over into that market. So what do we do? Well, ultimately, we'll answer some of that in a future module. But just big picture to get our thinking started, if we want to talk about a return to a natural rate here, a couple of options on the table. So perhaps if wages should fall for the market to clear, we should just wait for wages to fall. But what if that takes years or even a decade? Well, we could wait for the demand for labor to return. What if we just wait for that economy to get stronger again? Also sounds great, but doesn't happen as fast as you might want. Now, something we didn't see so much happen in the United States, but that some countries experimented with during the Great Recession, perhaps we can make that worker coordination thing happen. And instead of everybody agreeing to a wage cut, instead of layoffs, we just reduce the work week across the board. So still, in some sense, unemployment, because people aren't having as many hours as they want. But instead of concentrating it on some workers losing their jobs, we just sort of share the pain. So that was very interesting. But where we're going to arrive in a future module, I think this is the standard prescription in this day and age, is because labor markets don't adjust all that perfectly, the best and fastest move might be, can we just actively stabilize the economy? Can we take policy steps that will make recessions shorter and thereby return labor demand to its normal level more quickly? And that concludes our discussion of unemployment. Hopefully at this point, you know how to explain frictional, structural, and cyclical unemployment. You can apply a supply and demand model to the labor market, even though it's maybe not the most appropriate model for it. But in terms of deviations from standard supply and demand, you can explain the relationship between the natural rate of unemployment, potential GDP, productivity, and public policy, and also explain the relationship between sticky wages and cyclical unemployment. I will see you next time.